We've been telling you that building up to the March 12th budget speech, remember the decision that was taken to postpone the budget speech to the 12th of March. We have Ntokozo Khumalo in studio every morning as we build up to that budget speech. And this morning she's going to be having a conversation, also looking into a conversation that took place and a meeting, I guess, that took place between the Reserve Bank, or rather that took place between the SARS Commissioner as well as the Finance Minister. And this is all about the contentious issue of taxes. It's over to you, Ntokozo.
Thanks, Aldrin. Well, indeed, the conversations there around growing the economy, Finance Minister Ntokozo at those G20 side meetings, calling from the member states from the developed nations to invest in the country in an effort, of course, to grow the economy and boost the country's revenue. But I do have Noeleen Thahane from PPS for Professional Financial Advisor. Thank you so much for joining us in studio here. Now, I think the big question is, does South Africa have a revenue problem or do we have a spending problem?
Okay, so I think how we should look at it is that it's actually both, right? Because we don't have enough, we'll never have enough. Our revenue will never have enough because what we need it for is unlimited, right? So we have a revenue problem in that sense, but then because we have a revenue problem, we have a allocation problem as well because we don't have enough to allocate to everything. So now the allocation needs to be efficient. So it goes both ways.
And we do have some graphics to take a look at that just gives a picture of where we get our revenue from. But it also shows the picture of our expenditure and our debt seemingly growing a lot faster than the revenue that we bring in. And I'd like us to just listen to a bite around how we can sort of expand that tax base, because the argument has been we cannot afford to hike taxes anymore. But let's listen to that bite and then we'll continue on that conversation.
Okay.
A lot more agile, a lot more innovative to take on, the changing global environment. Things like cryptocurrencies. SMEs would adopt that before you'd have a large corporate adopt that. You'd have innovation in the AI space. Taking learning modules like ChatGPT, like Google's Gemini, and adopting it within their own processes and innovating from there. More incentives would be valid, and more meaningful incentives. If you take Small Business Corporation, which would have incentivized small businesses, it's limited to a very small niche within that SME space. It's the single shareholder type owner business. But SMEs have evolved since then, and no incentive has sort of been put in place to help with that. If we look at international, say, accounting standards, they've even issued an accounting standards for SMEs to simplify the compliance.
So I think if we can have those graphics again, so we can take a quick look at it. Basically, what Moodley is saying there is that we should tap into the SMME space to boost our tax base. Is there value in that?
There could be value in that because our SMME space is largely informal, right? So which means that some of the transactions that happen in that space are cash, which means that we don't get revenue because we then have to rely on people actually saying that this is how much cash I've gotten from all of my transactions, and then SARS being able to collect from that. So there could be value in that, yeah.
And there's a concept that I heard about that speaks to sort of that tax revenue that government does collect on an annual basis. Behavioral tax, and I suppose that goes across the board, corporates, SMMEs, and even us personally. Explain that concept of behavioral tax and how that impacts the revenue the country collects.
Okay, so behavior tax is basically, when you think of tax, tax has become synonymous with costs, right? So anything that costs you now is dubbed a tax. So if your family costs you as a black person, it's called black tax. So behavioral tax is the tax of decision making. It's basically the cost of decision making. So the decision to then not declare how much cash transactions we have, so we don't have access to that, to tap into that revenue. The decisions to, as individuals, maybe if you're an investor, to switch between funds and lose money, that's the concept of what it means.
And I struggle with that. You know, when you need the funds, you say, I'm going to save 10,000 Rand or I'm going to save 1,000 Rand, and an emergency comes up, and you take those funds, move it to somewhere where you think you might be able to get a higher interest. So that actually impacts one at the end of the day.
You got it absolutely right. So that's what behavior tax is basically.
And now, we're hearing from both Finance Minister Noeleen and the SARS Commissioner, who are then engaging with the G20 members around what it is that we need to do to really boost our revenue. If we compare the national budget to our own personal budget, similar principles, what is it that one needs to do and the country can do to boost that revenue?
So we need to look at, you have it quite nicely there to say that we can compare it to our personal budgets, right? And sometimes you are in a situation where you have to cut costs, right? Or you have to go and look for more income, get a promotion, start a side hustle, whatever the case is. We are in a similar situation right now, right? So, and that's why Minister and a Commissioner are looking at how to increase revenue, because we need to service costs. But there is the flip side where we could be looking at reducing costs, right? Because
especially when most of the cost is debt and debt repayments, which doesn't really help boost the revenue at all, or the economy at all.
And look at it this way, right? Increasing revenue by hiking VAT, for instance, that is going to curb spending. It's going to take away spending power from South African households. And this is the same spending power we've just been given back with the cut in interest rates. So it's like we're playing a ping pong back and forth, basically.
And now on the 12th of March, we are then expecting for the budget to be tabled. How should, it's not much time really for things to be that different. But in terms of then looking forward and ways for the country to boost revenue, what innovative and new ways could we bring to the table to boost that revenue? One idea was suggested they look into SMMEs and try to, get them into the tax base. But what other ways could we be looking at?
That's a good way, right? And there are many ways that we could get revenue increased. Taxes are one way, but then we also have revenue that you can get through sale of public properties. There are different ways. However, I do believe that we should more be looking into where the revenue actually goes, whether we actually need more revenue or we need to take a look at our costs, right? Yes, the SMEs can contribute, but you also don't want to discourage entrepreneurship in that same breath, right? You could increase personal income tax, but also we have a high unemployment rate, so there's a large population that's not going to participate in that. You could go into corporate income tax, but then even then you run the risk of jobs being cut, because now corporate isn't going to look at it and say, we are going to increase our revenue to afford tax. They might look at it and say, okay, we need to cut costs, and then jobs are on the line, which then contributes again to the high unemployment rate. So I'm not sure if looking at increasing revenue is what we should be doing so much as looking at the costs side of things.
So that allocation, where do we allocate our revenue? And Noeleen, you deal with obviously investments for professionals. And I just made that parallel between the national budget and our own budgets. Maybe just a little bit of snippet of advice for those professionals that are feeling the pressure of tax, that are feeling the pressure of the cost of living. How do we apply some of those lessons? I mean, it's hard to say, look at where you can cut down expenses when those expenses are things like school fees and food and things that you need to survive, really. So how do we navigate that? Because we all know salaries grow a little slower than inflation on most things. So just drawing that parallel between our national budgets and personal budgets, how do we do that?
Okay, so this is going to be the opposite of what I said for government, right? So cutting costs isn't always going to be feasible or possible, or downgrading your lifestyle. So on the personal side of things, look at increasing income, right? There are different ways to do that, whether it be you will invest so that you can get dividends and interest, or whatever the case is, whether it is you are going to start a side hustle, whether you are going to join a stokvel, whatever it is. On the personal side of things, everybody benefits when us as individuals earn more, when we have more money. That also means that government will get more revenue. Get people who are unemployed into the employment space, then we have more personal income tax to collect. So on the individual side of things, I do believe that we need to look at increasing income. That's the biggest thing for me, if you can increase your income. And it takes the same amount of energy to look at your budget and try to cut costs as it takes to look at how you can increase your income.
And I mean, it's a tough environment, but I suppose opportunities are there to be able to do that. But Noeleen, thank you so much for joining us in studio, and we'll leave the conversation there for now. Of course, Noeleen Thahane is a financial advisor with PPS for Professionals, just giving us a lowdown and those parallels on our personal budgets and the national budget, Aldrin, and where we can look to boost revenue. But the difference, as she said there, that from a government point of view, it really is about allocation. How do we allocate that revenue and make sure that where we put it in actually makes a difference in terms of growing the economy, then having that dent in employment and reviving that spending from citizens, Aldrin.
Thank you so much for that chat then, Thokozo Khumalo, as well as Noeleen Thahane. So what's your take on that, especially when it comes to the taxes? We're going to go to Andy now.